Welcome to Marxian Economics, Econ 305. I am Dipankar Basu at the University of Massachusetts Amherst in the Department of Economics. Today I am going to talk about the class, about the course, give you an overview of the class, talk about the content of the class, talk about the organization of the class, and also give you some learning goals. This is a class in Marxian political economy. So that means we are going to build a conceptual framework to understand capitalism from a Marxist perspective. That will be the core of the class. The main content of the course will be the mature economic writings of Karl Marx. And by mature economic writings, I mean the fact that Marx developed over the course of his life as a scholar. And we are going to look at the main body of economics that he left, that he wrote from the mid-1860s onwards. That is what I mean by the economic writings of Marx. And that has come down to us primarily in the 3 volumes of Capital. So the main content of the class will be a deep analytical study of the 3 volumes of Capital. Of course, the capitalism that Marx studied and described is different from the capitalism that we see today. In certain respects is the same, but there are many institutional features and details which have changed. Therefore, where necessary, we will follow later efforts to extend, deepen and develop Marx's ideas, so that at the end of it, we have a coherent and comprehensive Marxist perspective to understand different features of capitalism. So let me briefly talk to you about the organization of the class. The course will be divided into 4 big modules. We can think also of the course as being divided into 2 parts. The first part is an introduction, and we will talk about some introductory issues and also some issues of method. The first part of the class will contain 1 module. That module will talk about Marx as a person, as a scholar. We will briefly look at his life. We will look at the body of work that has now been that now goes by the name of Marxism. We will briefly look at that. We will see that the body of work that we refer to as Marxism is comprised of 3 different strands of thought: classical German philosophy, English political economy, and French socialism. In this class, we will be spending most of the time studying the second component, political economy. But in the introductory class, in the introductory module, we want to get an overall picture of Marxism. And that's why we will look at Marxism, and we will also spend some time thinking about the methods that Marx used to do his research and to present his research. So that will be the first part, which consists of 1 module. The second part of the class is really the heart of the class. I will call it the logic of capital. It will comprise of 3 modules. Module 2, we will look at the argument that was developed by Marx in volume 1 of Capital, which we will see can be conceptualized as the processes that help us understand the generation and accumulation of surplus value. The second module in the second part, that is module 3, will be related to the realization of surplus value. So the first module is about generation and accumulation of surplus value. The second module is about the realization of surplus value. And the third and final module is about the distribution of surplus value. So this is the broad organization of the class. Now I would like to give you a little more detail about each of the modules. So as I said, the first part, which has just 1 module, deals with introductory issues. We will cover several topics in this module. So what are those? We will look at the life and times of Karl Marx. Very briefly, we will see how he developed as a scholar, how he came to the study of political economy, how he understood his work, and how he came to the conceptualization of the whole economic work in the 3 volumes of Capital. So that is something we are going to try to understand in the introductory part. We will also look at what I called Marxism, what is known these days as Marxism, which is comprised of which is a creative synthesis of 3 strands of European thought. So we will briefly look at each of those 3. While we do that, we are going to spend some time understanding 2 key ideas that Marx developed in the initial phase of his scholarly life, which we will call historical materialism and second, dialectics or the dialectical method. After we have done that, we will spend some time looking at the structure of Marx's main economic writing, which is Das Kapital, which is available to us in the 3 volumes of Capital. We will look at the structure because there is a logic to that structure, and unless we understand the logic behind that structure, we will not be able to understand the argument as it develops through the 3 volumes of Capital. So that's the first module, the first part of the class. The second part of the class is the heart of the course. What we will try to do in this part is to systematically develop Marx's political economy of capitalism as found in the 3 volumes of Capital. The key organizing concept in the second part of the course will be surplus value, and we will spend considerable amount of time trying to understand and build that concept. But if we accept that that is the organizing concept, then we will be able to understand the 3 volumes of Capital as the generation and accumulation of capital, which is the argument in volume 1, the realization of surplus value, which is the argument in volume 2, and the distribution of surplus value, which is the argument in volume 3. So that is why we will divide the second part of this course into these 3 modules, each dealing with 1 volume of Capital. Now let us look at each of these modules in a little more detail. The first module in the second part, which I am calling module 2, deals with the argument as presented in volume 1 of Capital. The focus of the analysis in this module is to understand the generation and accumulation of surplus value. While we do that, while that will be the main argument that we develop in this part of the class, we will also draw on later debates and developments. Debates which happened after Marx wrote his work, and developments which happened later which led Marxist scholars to extend the work that Marx had done, to develop some of his concepts, extend it further. The topics that will be part of this module will follow the argument that Marx had laid out in volume 1 of Capital. So we will start with an analysis of the commodity. That is the first concept that we will try to understand. By carefully looking at the concept of commodity, we will understand the labor theory of value. The labor theory of value will help us understand the relationship between labor, value, and money. So these are the 3 important concepts we will develop when we investigate the commodity in detail. With the analysis of value and money at hand, we will then move on to the next concept, which in a way is the central concept of Marx's work, which is surplus value. But to understand surplus value, we needed to understand value, and that is why we started with the commodity. But now, once we have understood the commodity, we have understood value. With that, we will move on to understanding the concept of value, surplus value. And with the concept of surplus value, we will be able to understand the concept of capital. This second topic, surplus value and capital, is one of the central concepts that we would like to develop, and we will develop it carefully and slowly. With the understanding of surplus value and capital in place, we will move on to the third concept, which is to understand the changes that have happened in the production process under the domination of capitalist relations of production. Here we will understand the relationship or the effect that capitalist relations of production has had on labor and on nature. So labor and nature are the two primary sources of wealth in societies, and we would like to understand, following Marx's argument, the effect that capitalist relations of production have on these two foundations of wealth, on labor and on nature. Once we have understood that, we will move on to the next topic, which is an understanding of the accumulation of capital. So far, we have understood how surplus value is generated. But once surplus value is generated, we need to ask, what does the capitalist system do with it? What the capitalist system does with most of the surplus value that has been generated is to recommit it into the production process by increasing the scale of production, by purchasing new machinery, by purchasing new labor power. That process is captured by accumulation of capital. So we are going to next study the accumulation of capital. Once we have finished the first four topics, we have finished the main argument that Marx developed in volume 1 of Capital, which related to the generation of surplus value and the accumulation of surplus value. At the end of volume 1 of Capital, after Marx has developed these concepts, what we get is a pretty good and abstract model to understand some of the key features of capitalism. But once we have understood this, a question naturally crops up. How did the capitalist system emerge as a historical system of production? And Marx brings in the concept of primary accumulation of capital, which is the next topic of study to answer that question. So we will end the second module by looking at this concept of primary accumulation of capital. As I said, while this will be the main argument that we will develop in this part, we will also draw on later debates. And here let me point out some of the later debates that I will draw on and show you the location of those discussions. When we study surplus value and capital, one of the important concepts that we will try to understand is how the capitalist system values labor power. Labor power is the ability to do work which inheres in the body of the worker. In capitalism, the worker has to sell this ability to do work for a wage. It creates a lot of important issues. One important issue that Marx discussed, but not in great detail, was that behind the commodities that a worker purchases to reproduce himself over time, daily, there is the unwaged work that goes on within the household. This is what Marxist feminists in the 1960s and 70s brought to the discussion through the notion of domestic labor and social reproduction. So this is an area of considerable research and work that has really taken off from the 1970s onwards, and while in the 1990s and 2000s it was submerged under other discussions, it has made a recent comeback. So we are going to spend some time discussing Marxist feminist debates on domestic labor and social reproduction when we talk about the generation of surplus value and capital. The next topic that we are going to talk about, which Marx discussed but which later authors have developed and deepened, relate to some of the issues that become important when we study the effect of capitalist relations on the production process. And here I have three important issues that we are going to discuss. As I said, the two foundations of wealth in society are labor and nature. And capitalist relations of production have an impact on both these foundations. When we discuss production relation under capitalism, in addition to studying the discussion in volume 1 of Capital, we are going to study some of the later works that looked at the degradation of work under capitalist relations of production and how that impacts the worker. So that will be the first topic that we are going to talk about, which is in addition to the discussion in volume 1. The second foundation of wealth is nature, and capitalist relations of production have a very perverse impact on nature. From the 1960s onwards, there has been a discussion about capitalism and ecology, and Marxists have made a lot of contributions to that debate. So the second important issue that we are going to discuss in this area when we discuss production under capitalism will be the relationship of Marxism and ecology. What does Marxism have to say about ecology? Can a Marxist perspective give us some insights about understanding the ecological crisis? The third topic that we are going to discuss when we discuss production under capitalism is some recent developments. And here I am referring to discussions of the information sector, discussions of the commodification of knowledge, the increasing use of knowledge and information in the production process. This discussion has emerged from the 1990s onwards with the increasing use of information and knowledge in the production process. And some theorists have pointed out that capitalism, just like it commodifies labor, it tries to commodify nature, it has also started commodifying knowledge and information. How does a Marxist look at this process of commodification of knowledge and information? So that is the third issue which we will try to understand under this topic of production under capitalism. The last topic that we will try to understand, which Marx did discuss but which has again resurfaced in discussions, in contemporary discussions of capitalism, is a reformulated notion of the primary accumulation of capital, which goes by the concept of accumulation by dispossession, which has been brought to the discussion by David Harvey. Many people see recent developments in many parts of the world, including the first world and the third world, as an enactment of the primary accumulation of capital all over again. We are going to try to discuss that concept and engage with the literature which tries to use the notion of accumulation by dispossession to understand recent developments. So that is what we are going to cover in the second module, which is a development of the argument as laid out in volume 1 of Capital, interlaced with later developments, later debates by scholars who have tried to use, deepen and extend Marx's ideas. With that, now let me move on to the next module. Next module is a development of the argument as laid out in volume 2 of Capital. The focus of the analysis in this module will be an analysis of the realization of surplus value. Now, what do I mean by that? In volume 1 of Capital, Marx implicitly assumes that all the commodities that have been produced can find buyers, and they can be sold at prices which are adequate to realize all the surplus value that are embedded in them. Now, that is something that does not happen automatically. So Marx knew that this is a problem that needs to be investigated. but he abstracted from this issue in volume 1. In volume 1, he comes back to this issue and analyzes lot of the important issues related to this question. All those questions, all those issues can be analyzed under the rubric of this broad concept of realization of surplus value. So that will be the primary focus of the analysis that we will develop in this module, which relates to understanding different aspects of the problem of realization of surplus value through the sale of commodities. The specific topics under which we will break this discussion will be the following. The first topic we will look at is how the framework that we have built allows us to understand economic growth from a different perspective. When we understand economic growth from the Marxist perspective, the two important ideas that will be there is something that we will borrow from the argument that we have already developed. Economic growth in capitalism means an expansion of the value creation process. The expansion of the value creation process happens because of two reasons. One, the system generates more surplus value, which is accumulated, which is plowed back into the production process, which increases the scale of production. The second way in which the system increases the scale of the production of value is if the value that has been created and embedded in commodities get realized through sale quickly enough. So how much surplus value is generated per unit of labor and how quickly it is converted back into monetary form, it is realized. Those are the two key ideas that underlie economic growth under capitalism. Using the concept of the circuit of capital, we will be able to understand those issues. The second topic that I mentioned, how quickly surplus value and value is realized, relates to the idea that Marx developed, which is the turnover time of capital. So that is the second topic we are going to discuss in this part of the class. Then we come to the heart of the matter. The heart of the matter in this in this argument is, as I said, the question of how does the capitalist system generate enough demand to purchase all the commodities that it has produced. So that is the third topic that we are going to understand, how the capitalist system is able to generate adequate aggregate demand to purchase all the commodities that it has produced. And here the issue of money and credit are going to be important. So here we will understand how money, credit generates enough aggregate demand to purchase all the commodities that has been produced. And the last topic we are going to talk about in this module relates to what we can understand as the material basis of production. When production takes place, it needs to be of a particular type. A particular proportionality needs to be established between the production of, say, food and machines. If too much machines is produced relative to food, the system will get into a crisis. If too little food is produced relative to machines, the system will again get into crisis. So there are certain proportionalities that need to be established if the capitalist system is to reproduce itself smoothly over time. All those issues will be analyzed under the topic of use value basis of capitalist reproduction, or what we can understand as the material basis of capitalist production. So those are the main topics that we will discuss in volume 2, all of which can be analyzed under or with reference to the question, how does the capitalist system generate enough aggregate demand to realize all the surplus value that it has produced. So let me pause. In the previous module, we understood the argument developed in volume 1 as to how the capitalist system generates and accumulates surplus value. In this module, we have understood all the problems that need to be solved by the capitalist system to ensure that it can realize all the surplus value that it has generated, which we analyzed in the previous module. The next thing that Marx does, and something that follows logically, is to understand how this surplus value which has been realized is now distributed throughout society, and that is precisely the content of the next module. The next module follows the argument laid out in volume 3 of Capital, and the main focus of the analysis is to understand how the surplus value which has been generated and realized through sale of commodities is then distributed in society, and how it emerges as the revenue and income of different fractions of the ruling class. The argument proceeds in two logically separate steps, and we are going to follow Marx. In the first step, Marx analyzes the competition between capitalists and how the competition between capitalists manifests itself through the mobility of capital across sectors, and that leads to the emergence of what he calls prices of production. This is a concept he takes from classical economists like Ricardo. In addition to the prices of production, or in conjunction with the prices of production, emerge an average rate of profit. So the idea here is that if a capitalist is in a sector which earns lower than the average rate of profit, then the capitalist will have an incentive to move from that sector into another sector which earns a higher rate of profit. This process is the process by which surplus value which is created in the production process gets redistributed. The redistribution of surplus value leads to the emergence of a set of prices which support the same rate of profit across all industries. That is the rate of profit which Marx calls the average rate of profit. Why is that important? Because that is the point at which the incentive of capitalists to move between sectors is no longer there, because every sector earns the same average rate of profit. So this is the first step of the argument. We will understand how there is a strong tendency in capitalist economies for the mobility of capital across sectors in search of higher rates of profits, and how the long-run equilibrium of that process can be understood as the emergence of a set of prices which Marx calls prices of production and an average equal rate of profit across sectors. The important key insight here is that the emergence of prices of production is the process by which there is a redistribution of surplus value across sectors. So that's the first step of the argument. Before we move to the second step of the argument, we will take a detour. We will take a detour to understand one important concept that comes from classical political economy, which is the difference between productive and unproductive labor. We will see that in a certain sense, if we follow Marx's argument, we will be able to distinguish between productive labor and unproductive labor. What does it mean? Well, what we mean by productive labor is simple. Labor which is engaged in the production of surplus value is productive from the perspective of capitalism. So Marx is careful to always emphasize that the notion of productive and unproductive labor should not be understood transhistorically. The notion of productive and unproductive labor that we are going to talk about relates to, or is relevant only with reference to capitalism. With reference to capitalism, we will be able to distinguish between labor which creates surplus value and therefore is productive for capital, productive of capital, and all other labor which does not create surplus value and therefore is not productive of capital. The important point is that all labor which is not productive of capital, their income, their revenue is part of the surplus value created by productive labor. So that is why this difference, this distinction is conceptually important. We are going to delve into this issue to see how it gives us some key insights about different sectors in this economy. For instance, the financial sector, the whole sector which is related to speculation, banking, real estate, all those sectors will be unproductive of capital, and that implies that all the people who are involved in those sectors, the capitalists, the workers, all of their incomes are really a way in which they get part of the surplus value generated by productive workers elsewhere in the economy. With that detour in place, we are going to come back to the main line of argument, which is to understand the distribution of surplus value. So the first step of the argument we understood as mobility of capital and the emergence of prices of production. Now we come to the second part of the argument. The second part of the argument tells us that once this surplus value has been distributed through the emergence of prices of production, a second process happens, which is a further distribution or redistribution of the surplus value into three income streams. The first income stream is commercial profit. Commercial profit is the profit earned by capitalists who are involved in the pure buying and selling of commodities, that is trade. They are neither involved in the production, neither in the transportation. They are primarily involved in the trade. So all that happens in trade is that there is a transfer in ownership of the commodity from one person to another. All capitalists who are involved in this are what we will call commercial capitalists, and their profit by definition cannot be value, because they do not create any value, because they are not creating commodities. They are just transferring ownership, which means that the profit earned by that capitalist in that sector comes from some surplus value generated elsewhere. This is the first fragment of surplus value that we are going to study in the second step of the argument, and this is what Marx calls commercial profit. The second fragment of surplus value that we are going to understand is what Marx calls interest. What is interest? Interest is a part of the surplus value that is appropriated by owners of money. Why do they get it? Well, because capitalist production requires substantial amounts of funds. Oftentimes, the capitalist enterprise does not have the funds available to hire workers, to purchase machines. Therefore, they borrow that funds from other capitalists, either directly or through the banking and financial system. The capitalists who are the owners of the stocks of money can charge a part of the surplus value that will be generated by the use of their funds. This part is what we call interest. And therefore, we can see that the interest income comes out of the surplus value generated by the use of the funds. So the owners of the funds get a part of the surplus value, and that is what we call interest. The third fragment of surplus value is what Marx calls rent. What is rent? Well, rent is a part of the surplus value that is appropriated by owners of natural resources like land. So the key feature of this natural resource is that it is non-reproducible. So human beings cannot create land. It is given by nature. It is fixed in quantity. That is the second important aspect. It is fixed in quantity. It cannot be increased if there is an increase in the demand for the use of that resource. So for instance, if there is an increase in the population and there is an increase in the demand for food, more land will be produced. Therefore, owners of the land will be able to withhold the use of that resource unless they are given a part of the surplus value. The part of surplus value that is appropriated in this way by owners of natural resources like land is what Marx calls rent. So with that, we will complete the argument. We have understood, so let me quickly give you So let me pause and also point out that even in this part of the class, we are going to be able to discuss and draw on some later discussions. So there are two important areas that we are going to be able to draw on later scholarship. When we are discussing interest, we are also going to be discussing this important issue of fictitious capital. This discussion will allow us to engage in recent discussions on two aspects. One, financialization of the contemporary economy. So there has been a lot of discussion about financialization, especially after the 2007-2008 crisis. We are going to look at that discussion from a Marxist perspective. The related issue is that when the financial system becomes large compared to the real economy, it generates instability and crisis. The key crisis that we have in mind is the 2007-08 crisis, which started in the US in the housing market. So these are the kinds of issues that we are going to be able to discuss when we discuss the issue of interest and fictitious capital. The second area that we are going to be able to discuss is when we discuss rent, we are going to be able to discuss land rent. We are also going to be able to discuss real estate prices. So Marx's analysis allows us a way to understand the emergence of land rent, and using the concept of land rent, it also allows us to understand real estate prices. We are also going to be able to engage with a recent literature which has proposed that if we look at sectors like software or pharmaceuticals, we can understand the income generated in those sectors, which apparently have very high rates of profit, as monopoly rent. So the issue of rent is going to be will allow us to engage with this recent discussion about monopoly rent that is related to the commodification of knowledge and information. So let me summarize. The course will have 4 modules. The first module will be an introduction to Marxism and some methodological issues. Module 2, 3 and 4 is the heart of the course, and in these modules we develop the argument as found in the mature writings of Marx, by which I mean the 3 volumes of Capital. So these 3 modules will allow us to delve into the details of the argument and develop it step by step. Let me now talk about some logistical issues. So readings for this class. Each topic will have 2 types of readings. There will be required readings and there will be further readings. Required readings are essential and you cannot miss them. They have to be read. Required readings will be again of 2 types. There will be lecture notes and there will be additional readings which will either be chapters from books or papers. You have to read both. But in addition to required readings, for each topic or for most of the topics, I will present some further issues that can be explored, and I will present some papers or chapters from books which can be used. These are something that you don't really need to read for this course, but I would encourage you to do so. If you do so, you will be able to explore some topic in greater detail, engage with some recent debates and developments. What about evaluation? Evaluation in this course will be based on 2 things. So there will be a total of 100 points in this course, and they will be divided into 2 parts. 90 points will come from response papers and 10 points will come from a media project. Response papers, there will be 10 response papers that you will have to write, and we will choose the 9 best response papers. Each response paper will be worth 10 points, and that therefore will count for 19 points. The rest of the 10 points will come from a media project. Let me talk a little bit more about the response papers and the media project. So response papers, roughly response papers will be of 1200 words, roughly about 4 pages. For each response paper, a question will be given and a specific set of readings will also be given. What we will be looking for in the response paper are 2 things. A clear, logically coherent answer to the question using the reading that has been assigned. Second, we will certainly be looking for evidence that you have actually read the reading and have used it to answer the question. So let me just reiterate. You need to read the assigned reading and you need to use it to answer the question in a clear and logically coherent manner. Let me give a note of caution. Do not use any other material for answering the question, especially material which are of an online nature. Wikipedia or other sources you should not be using. You should be only using the readings that have been assigned to answer the questions. So this is what a response paper will be, roughly 1200 words, a coherent answer using the reading. The media project is a fun project. What we want you to do is to search through the media. It can be newspapers, it can be videos, it can be books, it can be magazines. What we want is for you to identify a topic that is of interest to you in the media, but which can be explained with reference to some concept that we have developed in this class. Using those concepts, we want you to write a 1200 word essay on the whatever you have found. So the media project again will be about 1200 words. We want a clear, logically coherent narrative on the media piece, and the most important part of your narrative is that it should use some concept we have developed in this class to make sense of whatever item you have found in the media. The last thing I'd like to talk about is the learning goals. What will you learn after you have taken this course? There are several things that you will learn. First, you will get an introduction to the body of thought known as Marxism. That's the first thing. When we do so, you will come to know that Marxism is a creative synthesis of 3 strands: German philosophy, English political economy, French socialism. In this course, we are going to spend most of the time studying political economy. So the second thing you will learn is a deep appreciation of Marxist political economy. What does that mean? It means that at the end of the class, at the end of the course, you will have a coherent framework to understand key features of capitalism. That coherent framework built from ideas that Marx propounded. Now that coherent framework will allow you to understand 2 things. It will allow you to understand the existing structure of capitalism, what preserves it, but it will also allow you to understand its contradictions and what propels the system towards change. While you get that overall framework, you will also be able to engage with recent debates from a Marxist perspective. You will be able to understand issues related to the continuing exploitation of workers all through the world. You will be able to understand the basis of women's oppression from a Marxist perspective. You will be able to understand the causes and the consequences of the ecological crisis from a Marxist perspective. You will get a key perspective from a Marxist lens to look at the financialization of contemporary capitalism. And you will also get a way to understand the digital economy, the commodification of knowledge and information. With that, let me stop and welcome you to Marxian economics once again. Thank you.